The steam gauge was reading 347 psi when it should have been holding steady at 290. I was 2 floors down from the executive offices when that bearing started screaming like a banshee, and I knew we had about 3 minutes before the whole press line went down. Name's Robert Mitchell, but everyone calls me Bob. I'm 58. Been working quality control at Apex Steel for the last 15 years, Army engineer before that. I hit the emergency stop and watched 50,000 pounds of steel press machinery coast to a halt. The floor vibration dropped from its usual 2.3 hertz to dead silence. Third time this month we'd had pressure spikes on line 7, and the third time Brendan Hawthorne had signed off on a quick patch job instead of proper maintenance. Brendan was the nephew of our CEO Charles Hawthorne, and he had this habit of treating safety protocols like suggestions. Fresh out of business school with ideas about optimizing operational efficiency by cutting what he called redundant maintenance windows. Kid was 32 and thought he knew better than guys who'd been running machinery since before he was born. I pulled my micrometer from my breast pocket and started documenting. Click, 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 minus, adjusting to 0.001 increments while I measured the shaft wear. The readings were way outside tolerance. This wasn't just equipment fatigue. Someone had been running this press beyond specifications for weeks, maybe months. The bearing housing showed wear patterns consistent with sustained overload operation. Temperature readings on the hydraulic reservoir were running 15 degrees above normal. Metal shavings in the oil filter told a story of accelerated component degradation. Every measurement I took painted the same picture. This equipment was being pushed past its design limits. Maria Santos from the union walked over while I was taking measurements. She'd been at Apex for 22 years, started on the floor and worked her way up to shop steward. Maria had this way of knowing things before they became official problems. "How bad is it, Bob?" she asked, watching me document the bearing damage. "Bad enough that we shouldn't have been running this line for the past 2 weeks, I said, showing her the measurement readings. Someone's been overriding the automatic shutdown protocols. Maria's face tightened. She'd seen what happened when companies cut corners on safety maintenance. Her brother had lost 3 fingers at a plant in Detroit when management decided preventive maintenance was too expensive. "This is the 3rd emergency stop this month," she said. "Pattern like that. OSHA's going to start asking questions." That's when Diane Foster from HR showed up with her clipboard and that smile that never reached her eyes. Diana was maybe 45, always dressed like she was heading to court, and had a talent for making routine conversations feel like interrogations. She'd transferred over from some consulting firm about 8 months ago, right around the time Charles started talking about operational efficiency improvements. "Bob, we need to see you upstairs," she said, glancing at the machinery like it personally offended her. Something about irregularities in safety documentation and a pattern of non-compliance issues. I knew exactly what this was. Brendan's cost-cutting measures had finally caught up with him, and they needed someone to blame. 3 weeks earlier, OSHA had scheduled a surprise inspection after receiving an anonymous tip about safety violations. Word was they'd be here within the month, and Brendan's pet project of running machinery at 110% capacity to meet quarterly targets was about to get the company hit with federal fines. The conference room had those uncomfortable chairs and fluorescent lights that hummed at exactly 120 hertz. Diane slid a stack of papers across the table like she was dealing cards, each page marked with yellow sticky tabs. The documents looked official, but something felt off about the formatting. "Bob, we've discovered some serious discrepancies in your safety reports," she said, arranging the papers in what looked like a prepared presentation. "Equipment approvals that don't match actual inspection data. Maintenance deferrals that bypass federal protocols." I kept my hands flat on the table, but my thumb was already working the micrometer in my pocket. Click, click. The papers had my electronic signature, but the timestamps were wrong. According to these documents, I'd signed off on safety inspections at 2:47 a.m. on a Sunday when I'd been fishing at Cedar Lake with my grandson. The letterhead looked right, and the formatting matched our standard forms, but the serial numbers were off. Every legitimate safety report I filed carried a unique identifier embedded in the header, invisible to normal reading, but traceable through federal databases. These documents had generic placeholders where those numbers should be. "I'll need time to review these documents," I said, keeping my voice level. "And I'd like to see the federal database synchronization codes." Diane's expression tightened slightly. She wasn't expecting technical questions. "Bob, the company's prepared to offer a generous separation package. Early retirement with full benefits. You've got 20 years of good service here. The room temperature seemed to drop 3 degrees. They weren't just firing me. They were trying to buy my silence before I could ask too many questions about those forged documents. I asked for specifics about the alleged violations. She pointed to a safety manual, version 2019.3, but I noticed immediately it was outdated. We'd updated to OSHA standard 2021.7 18 months ago after new federal requirements came down. They'd grabbed an old copy from somewhere, probably hoping I wouldn't notice the discrepancy. "I'll need the current manual," I said calmly, "and the Federal Compliance Database access codes for verification." That's when I knew they'd picked the wrong inspector to frame. 23 years in the Army teaches you something about documentation and chain of custody. Every safety report I filed had that unique serial number embedded in the header, like an invisible signature that couldn't be faked or duplicated. Diane handed me a temporary suspension letter, suggesting I clear out my desk that afternoon. The letter was dated 3 days ago, before this meeting had even been scheduled. Someone had been planning this conversation for longer than they'd admitted. I nodded and left, but my mind was already racing through the evidence chain, the forged documents, the outdated manual, the predated suspension letter. This wasn't a spontaneous disciplinary action. Someone had orchestrated this whole setup in advance. I packed my toolbox while eyes flickered from laptop screens throughout the office. My micrometer clinked against the steel measuring blocks as I wrapped everything in oilcloth. Some of the guys looked sympathetic. Others seemed relieved it wasn't them facing the corporate buzzsaw. 20 years of building relationships, and now I was walking out like some kind of criminal. Steve Garrison from Building Security stopped by my locker. Steve was ex-Navy, about my age, and we'd shared enough coffee breaks to know each other's stories. He pretended to check his radio while he talked. "Your name showed up on a watch list last week," he said quietly, before any formal complaint existed. "Came down from executive level, marked for enhanced monitoring." My stomach dropped. A watch list created before they'd even decided what I'd supposedly done wrong. That meant someone had been planning this frame-up for days, maybe weeks. "Any idea who requested it?" I asked, closing my locker for what might be the last time. Steve shook his head. Came through Diane's office, but the authorization code was from upstairs, way upstairs. I thanked him and headed for the parking lot, but my mind was already organizing evidence like puzzle pieces. The watch list, the forged documents, the predated suspension letter. Someone with executive access had orchestrated this whole thing in advance. That evening, I spread every safety report I'd filed in the last 6 months across my kitchen table. My wife Linda had passed 3 years ago, so the house was quiet enough to think. Real signatures, authentic timestamps, complete with serial numbers showing federal database synchronization. Each report showed consistent inspection patterns, systematic checks at proper intervals with detailed measurements, and regulatory compliance. But the forged reports showed something different. Safety approvals supposedly signed in the middle of the night from executive workstations. One report particularly stood out, supposedly signed by me at 2:47 a.m. on that Sunday, but my building access badge showed I hadn't even been in the facility that weekend. I pulled out my Army-issued field notebook and started cross-referencing. Every piece of equipment I'd flagged for mandatory maintenance had been mysteriously approved for continued operation during those late-night sessions. The pattern was clear. Someone with administrative access had used my credentials to override safety holds, allowing production to continue despite federal violations. The timeline was too convenient. Press Line 7 had been pushing 110% capacity for the past 6 weeks. Right when these fake approvals started appearing, Bendon's quarterly bonus was tied to production numbers, and he'd been bragging about beating targets by 12% this quarter. Now I knew how he'd done it. I opened my laptop and started documenting everything. Each forged signature, every timestamp discrepancy, all the maintenance deferrals that had kept those lines running when they should have been shut down for repairs. The evidence was damning. But I needed more than just discrepancies to prove intentional fraud. That's when I remembered something from my Army days. Every electronic document I created carried embedded metadata, information invisible to normal users, but traceable through forensic analysis. If someone had copied my templates to create those forged reports, my embedded serial numbers would be buried in their files like fingerprints. The next morning, I drove straight to the federal building downtown and filed a formal complaint with the OSHA regional office. I learned in military chain of command that when corruption goes high enough, you report outside the system. The receptionist directed me to Special Agent Roger Banks, a serious man in his 40s who looked like he'd seen enough corporate fraud to recognize the pattern. I cited specific federal regulations and attached a spreadsheet of equipment, serial numbers, inspection dates, and maintenance deferrals. Each entry included my embedded tracking codes and the discrepancies between my real reports and the forged versions. Mr. Mitchell, Banks said, reviewing my documentation, "These are serious allegations. We'll need to preserve all system access logs, equipment maintenance records, and safety database entries while we investigate." I requested specific preservation of building security footage, electronic access logs, and any documents bearing my supposed signature during off-hours periods. The key was my embedded serial numbers. If found in the forged documents, they'd prove someone had accessed my secure templates without authorization. Banks made notes throughout our meeting. We'll be in touch within 48 hours to schedule formal interviews. In the meantime, avoid discussing this investigation with current Apex personnel. Within hours of filing the federal complaint, my personal phone rang. Diane Foster calling from a blocked number. Her voice had a new edge, like she was reading from a prepared script. "Bob, this escalates things unnecessarily. We could resolve this quietly with an enhanced separation package, full pension, healthcare continuation, even a positive reference letter." The desperation in her tone told me everything. They needed my silence more than I needed their approval. A federal investigation would expose everything: the forged documents, the safety violations, the whole systematic override of protective protocols. "I'd like to see the federal database synchronization codes for those safety reports," I said calmly. She fumbled, clearly unprepared for technical questions. "I'd need to check with IT about that. But Bob, think about your future. You've got grandchildren to consider." The subtle threat wasn't lost on me, but it also confirmed my suspicions. They were scrambling, making mistakes. Each desperate move gave me more evidence of their coordination and advanced planning. "I'll wait for the federal investigation to conclude," I replied. After hanging up, I noticed a calendar notification on my phone. Mandatory laptop collection for routine maintenance upgrades, scheduled for the next morning. The timing was suspicious. They wanted my work computer right after I'd requested federal evidence preservation. I screenshot the maintenance notification and saved it with timestamp metadata. If they were planning to destroy evidence, I'd document every step of their obstruction. The federal investigators would want to know about any attempts to tamper with potential evidence after a preservation request had been filed. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak in the house made me think about Steve's warning and Diane's veiled threats. But underneath the worry was something else, a familiar feeling from my Army days, when we'd finally identified the enemy position and were ready to call in coordinates for artillery support. They'd picked the wrong engineer to frame. Every document they'd forged carried my invisible signature. Every late-night access they'd made was logged in systems they couldn't control, and every maintenance override they'd performed had left physical evidence in the machinery itself. The investigation was just getting started, but I already knew how it would end. Truth has a way of surfacing when people refuse to give up digging for it. The IT handoff meeting was scheduled for 8 a.m. in Conference Room B. I arrived early and placed my laptop on the table, speaking clearly for anyone who might be listening. Please note that a federal preservation hold is active on this device per OSHA investigation request, OSHA 9024-0847. The IT technician was a young guy named Carl Jensen, maybe 25, with nervous eyes and hands that shook slightly when he signed the equipment transfer form. Carl had been at Apex for about 2 years, seemed like a decent kid who followed procedures and stayed out of office politics. As I signed the handover paperwork, Carl glanced around the empty conference room. At the doorway, he paused and whispered, "They told me to wipe temporary logs after imaging." I didn't feel comfortable with that. My heart jumped, but I kept my expression neutral. "Thank you for following proper federal procedure," I said quietly. He nodded quickly and hurried away with my laptop. This was huge. They'd specifically instructed IT to destroy evidence after copying it. That went far beyond normal maintenance. It was deliberate obstruction of a federal preservation order. I immediately drove to a payphone outside a gas station and called Agent Banks. No sense using my personal cell for this conversation. When he answered, I kept it brief and factual. They're attempting to destroy preserved evidence. IT technician badge, number C2847, can confirm instructions to wipe logs after imaging. Banks was quiet for a moment. We'll follow up on that immediately. Thanks for the heads up, Mr. Mitchell. Back home, I printed every vendor approval I'd ever signed. Real signatures, authentic timestamps, complete with IP addresses showing where each approval originated from within the facility. I highlighted every policy clause I'd followed correctly, organizing everything chronologically like evidence in a court case. Each exhibit got a sticky note with a single sentence summary. Approval 284-7, signed from QC workstation during business hours, IP 120.168.1.47. Approval 285-1. Digital signature matches biometric authentication logs, verified database sync. The pattern became obvious immediately. My real approvals showed consistent timing, location data, and authentication methods. But the forged approvals showed something completely different. Digital signatures created in the middle of the night from workstations I'd never accessed, with IP addresses from the executive wing. One approval particularly stood out. It was supposedly signed by me at 2:47 a.m. on that Sunday I'd been fishing, but the workstation location was Charles Hawthorne's office. The IP address 192.168.112 was registered to the CEO's personal computer system. I stapled each exhibit carefully, creating a timeline that would be impossible for anyone to dismiss. The contradictions were glaring. I couldn't be in two places at once, and I certainly hadn't been sneaking into the CEO's office in the middle of the night to sign safety waivers. 3 days later, Agent Banks called to schedule interviews. Louise Crawford, the company's outside legal counsel, tried to block me from attending with personal representation. Her email cited internal investigation protocols and suggested I shouldn't need a lawyer for a simple clarification meeting. I forwarded her objection to my own attorney, Patricia Kowalski, a former federal prosecutor who specialized in whistleblower cases. Patricia's response was swift and legally precise. Client has absolute right to representation during any questioning that could affect employment status or federal compliance standing. The interview was scheduled for Friday morning in the federal building. Louise's attempt to isolate me had backfired, creating another piece of evidence showing corporate intent to deprive me of due process rights during a federal investigation. The interview room had glass walls and recording equipment. Agent Banks sat across from me with a legal pad, while Patricia took notes beside me. The questions were direct and technical. Did you approve continued operation of Press Line 7 outside federal safety parameters? Banks asked. I referenced my badge logs and building access records showing I'd never been in the facility during the timestamps in question. Every forged approval carried electronic signatures created when I was documented elsewhere. Fishing trips, grocery store receipts, even a doctor's appointment with timestamped medical records. When they asked about Brendan Hawthorne, I kept my answers factual and specific. Mr. Hawthorne requested expedited safety waivers for equipment operating beyond manufacturer specifications. I declined per federal regulation 29 CFR 19-2010-2012, which requires documented engineering analysis before exceeding design parameters. Banks made extensive notes throughout our conversation. As we concluded, he asked one final question that surprised me. Mr. Mitchell, have you heard of Titan Industrial Services before this investigation? I had to think for a moment. Yes, Brendan specifically requested expedited approvals for maintenance contracts with Titan. Said they offered specialized services other contractors couldn't provide. Banks' eyebrows rose slightly, and he made another note. After the interview, Patricia seemed satisfied with how it had gone. They asked about Titan before you mentioned it. She observed, someone else already flagged that contractor. The investigation was moving faster than Diane and her team realized. While they'd been focused on covering up the forged safety reports, the federal agents had been following money trails and vendor relationships that opened up entirely new avenues of inquiry. That afternoon, Brendan found me in the grocery store parking lot. His expensive BMW was parked next to my pickup truck, and he was leaning against the driver's side door like he owned the place. Still wearing that practiced smile, but his suit looked rumpled, and his confidence seemed forced. Tough week. Huh, Bob? He placed a hand on my shoulder like we were old friends sharing a difficult moment. Maybe we both got a little loose with procedures lately. These federal guys don't understand operational pressures like we do. I didn't respond, just watched his face while he shifted tactics. He lowered his voice conspiratorially, glancing around the parking lot like someone might be listening. Uncle Charles always says family looks out for each other during rough patches. The important thing is getting past this quickly without anyone getting hurt unnecessarily. The casual mention of his relationship to the CEO was supposed to remind me of the power structure I was challenging. But then Brendan made a crucial mistake that I almost missed. I'm sure this Phoenix tracking thing will sort itself out. Once IT explains the version conflicts, he said. Phoenix was my internal code name for the embedded serial number system, a detail I'd never shared with anyone at Apex, only with Agent Banks during the federal interview. Brendan had just revealed he'd seen my private case files or had access to federal investigation information he shouldn't have possessed. My expression didn't change, but internally I was celebrating. He just handed me smoking gun evidence that the cover-up extended beyond forged documents into active monitoring of the federal investigation itself. Good luck with everything, Brendan, I said calmly, getting into my truck. As I drove home, I called Patricia from my cell phone and left a brief message. Subject mentioned classified investigation details he shouldn't have access to. Meeting transcript should be preserved as evidence of ongoing obstruction. The net was tightening around all of them, and they didn't even realize how many mistakes they were making. A week later, OSHA completed their forensic analysis of the preserved systems. The email from Agent Banks was clinical and devastating. Serial number verification completed. Embedded tracking codes identified in production documents created 2:14 a.m. Sunday. Unauthorized access from user terminal BH-ACP02. BH-ACP02 was Brendan's executive workstation. My invisible serial numbers had traveled from my secure templates into the falsified safety approvals, proving definitively that he'd stolen my credentials to create the forgeries. Every forged signature carried my embedded tracking codes like fingerprints on a murder weapon. The timeline matched perfectly with building access logs I'd already provided. Brendan had been in the facility during a maintenance window when no legitimate safety work should have occurred. But the evidence got even better. Steve Garrison from security showed me something that made the whole conspiracy crystal clear. The camera system in the executive wing had experienced a routine maintenance outage for exactly 90 minutes, covering the period when my files were accessed and my credentials were used to create the forged approvals. The maintenance was performed by Secure View Solutions, a firm Diane had contracted at her previous company. The invoice showed they'd paid extra for after-hours service to ensure the cameras were offline during the crime. Someone had coordinated this cover-up down to the minute. Agent Banks requested a detailed walkthrough of my embedded serial number methodology. I explained it like teaching a technical safety class, the way I'd trained younger inspectors for 15 years. Each safety template carries unique identifier codes invisible to normal users, but traceable through federal forensic analysis. I demonstrated on a clean laptop. The system prevents exactly this kind of documentation fraud. Banks nodded as I showed him the verification process. So anyone accessing your templates would inadvertently copy these tracking signatures. Exactly. The codes are transparent during normal use, but traceable through federal database cross-referencing, like invisible ink under ultraviolet light. Across the conference table, I watched Diane's hands shake as she gripped her pen. She finally understood the implications. My embedded serial numbers had proved Brendan had stolen federal safety documents to create systematic approval fraud. The investigation expanded when OSHA obtained financial records for Titan Industrial Services. The results were devastating for the whole conspiracy. Payments were being routed through shell accounts that traced back to offshore companies controlled by Charles Hawthorne's family trust. The specialized maintenance services were pure fiction. Titan existed only on paper to justify inflated invoices that funded the cover-up operation. They'd been skimming federal compliance money to pay for document forgery, evidence destruction, and legal fees. 2 weeks later, the federal hammer fell hard and fast. Charles Hawthorne announced his immediate retirement to pursue other opportunities. Corporate speak for getting forced out in disgrace before criminal charges could be filed. Brendan's security badge was deactivated at 8:20 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. I watched from the break room window as federal agents escorted him from the building while workers gathered to see justice finally served. His expensive suit and practiced smile couldn't help him anymore. Diane Foster's resignation email arrived before lunch, citing exciting new consulting opportunities. Standard corporate language for fleeing before the indictments came down. She'd already hired a criminal defense attorney and was reportedly cooperating with federal prosecutors. The interim CEO, Wayne Phillips, was a straight R finance guy who'd been brought in specifically to clean house. He called me into his office on Friday afternoon with an offer I'd never imagined. "Bob, we're creating a new position, Director of Federal Safety Compliance, reporting directly to OSHA and the Board Audit Committee. Independent authority over all safety protocols with federal regulatory backing. The job description sounded like it had been written specifically for my background and experience. No more worrying about corporate politics or family connections interfering with safety decisions. We need someone who can't be bought, pressured, or silenced, Wayne explained. Someone who understands both systems and people, and isn't afraid to challenge authority when lives are at risk. I negotiated carefully. Training budget for developing younger safety inspectors, complete hiring autonomy for building my team, and an ethics charter bearing my name that would protect future whistleblowers from retaliation. The salary came with federal oversight protection, meaning anyone who tried to interfere with my safety decisions would face federal criminal charges. Never again would worker protection be vulnerable to corporate profit margins or family nepotism. One more condition I insisted on, minus a formal corporate acknowledgement that the company had violated federal safety regulations and my constitutional due process rights. Documented accountability in the public record, not just quiet internal settlements. Wayne agreed to everything without hesitation. The federal investigation had exposed liability issues worth millions in potential fines and lawsuits. Hiring me was the smartest insurance policy the company could buy. I didn't take my old desk back in the quality control lab. Instead, I chose a corner office overlooking the main production floor, where I could see the equipment running and hear the machinery humming at proper frequencies. This wasn't a return to my previous role. It was a promotion to something much more important. The irony was perfect. Their attempt to destroy me had created an opportunity they never intended. From the ashes of their conspiracy, I'd risen with federal authority backing every safety decision I made. 6 months later, I walked past that same conference room where my nightmare had begun. I ran my fingers along the cool door frame and thought about every worker who'd sat at similar tables, being told they were the problem when they were actually the solution. I left a laminated card on the union bulletin board. 3 simple lines about preserving truth through documentation, measurements, and calm determination. Maybe it would help the next person who found themselves wrongly accused. The new badge felt solid in my palm as I headed to my office each morning. I wasn't returning as a survivor of their story. I was the author of my own comeback, and the protector of every worker who came after me. The young safety inspectors I'd hired were eager and ethical, ready to build something meaningful. My micrometer still clicked softly in my pocket, but now it measured compliance with standards that had real teeth. They tried to frame me to protect the CEO's nephew, never expecting my systematic approach to evidence collection. They'd built their own destruction by underestimating how carefully an old Army engineer keeps his records. Now I was exactly where I belonged, in a position to ensure it never happened to anyone else. Federal regulations had won, as they always do when someone refuses to give up fighting for what's right. Listen, if you're reading this and you work in any kind of manufacturing or industrial setting, remember what I learned the hard way: document everything. Keep your own records. Trust your training over corporate pressure. When you see safety violations, report them through proper channels, but keep copies of everything for yourself. And remember, they can fire you, but they can't erase the truth if you've documented it properly. Stand up for what's right, because the guy working next to you is counting on you to keep him safe. That's what real men do.